The tricky bit, which we will go over, was the rhythm. I put a few of the trickier ones up on the board, and we'll just go through them. And you know, if you have any questions, we'll see if we can correct them. Chris Day, I can see the questions in your eyes.
Yeah, hi. Nice to meet you too.
All right. So, always when you're approaching something like this, you think in terms of groupings, right? Time signatures reflect the feeling of the music, you know, whether it's grouped in a large number of small units, whether it's grouped in duples or triples or quadruples. So your notation, you want to reflect that feeling, that grouping. So that's basically what this is all about. So let's take the first one here. We're in 4/4, right? So we'll have 4 quarter notes, right? That's the pulse. So you want the groupings to reflect that larger pulse. So we want pretty much in every measure there to be basically 4 or less kind of groupings together, right? So if we had, I don't know, 64 64th notes or whatever, I mean, if we had a whole bunch of smaller values, you'd want to group them all so that they'd be in groups of 4, right? In a 4/4 measure, as opposed to if we were in 2/4, you'd want 2 groups of 2 groups reflecting a quarter note. Okay, so here, what's wrong with this notation?
There are 8 notes.
Right. Nothing is grouped together. Nothing is grouped together. So, right. So we want to reflect 4 beats, right? So here, the first beat, down beat, we see 2 eighth notes, right? We want to beam those together. So there's one group. Yes. Next beat, a quarter note. That's fine, right? Next beat, once again, we want to group them together. Right, this is the easiest one, and I think most of you got this fine. Now the next measure is where something tricky happens, right? So we have downbeat, 1. Here's the second beat, right? 8th note rest. We want to group that together with the following 8th note into one group there, right? Because we're reflecting the 4 big beats. So in order to show that, we need to split this up into a tied 8th notes. All right? We would tie them together so it's the same value as a quarter note, right?
Oh, I see what I mean.
But here, so now we have beat 1, beat 2, right? And then 3. Beat 3, likewise, we'll have to split this one up into 2 8th notes, right? Yes, there, tied together. And then this would be the 4th. Right? Does that make sense?
Yes.
It's a bit tricky, it's a bit nitpicky. You'll often see music, especially if you play them in band. I mean, the composers who write all the time an 8th rest and then quarter notes for the rest of the measures, so you have this kind of offbeat feeling. But this is the more correct way of showing it because it shows you those 4 big beats. Okay? Does that make sense? Everyone see that? So a little bit tricky. We'll see more examples of this, as in number 2. Okay, so 6/8, remember, is a compound meter, right? Which means it's basically made up of 2 simpler meters. So a 6/8 would be basically like 2 3/8, right? So our groupings, we want to do 2 big groupings of 3, right? So why is this wrong then?
Because they grouped into 2s.
Right, you see how they're grouped into 2s? I mean, it's still the 6 8th notes, but it's the way this is written, this would be correct in 3/4, because then we have 3 duple beats. We want to reflect 2 triple beats, right? So we can take that off. There, that would be more indicative of 6/8. Okay, now what about that second measure there? What's wrong here? Right? Quarter note rest is 2 8th notes. So I mean, what you're really having here is 3 beats of duple. We want it to reflect 2 beats of triple. So, Chris Day, what would we do?
You would cut the quarter rest into 2 8th rests.
Correct.
8ths.
Correct, sir. Correct, sir. Now this is correct. Because before, with the quarter rest, it implied that there was those 2/8 would be grouped together, whereas they're not grouped together. Yes?
Would you also have to break the quarter note into 2/8 notes?
Oh, that's okay.
Because I did do that. I don't know.
Right,
Is
right.
that wrong?
You mean tied together?
Yeah.
It's unnecessary. I mean,
Okay.
you could do it. Quarter notes are okay as long as they're not crossing over the bigger beat, right? I mean, you have, well, here. 2 groups of 3, right? Quarter notes are okay because these 2/8 notes are equal to a quarter note, right? These 2/8 notes are also equal to a quarter note, but writing it like that implies that this 8th note and this 8th note should be grouped together, whereas they should not be grouped
Okay.
together. You know, we want to reflect the meter, so we want to reflect the 2 big 3 beats, right? So you can have quarter notes. You can have duple values in triple times. It's just you have to make sure that they don't obscure the overall triple meter. Okay, make sense, Phil? You just look out for the big groups. Okay, so likewise here in this one, I forgot to number it, but the 9/8 one, also a compound meter, also triple, right? We want 3 groups of 3/8. So we'll add one more to our formulation. So we want to group this into 3 groups of 3. All right. So how is this doing? What is the problem with the way this is written?
The dotted quarter note.
Actually, that quarter note is the only thing that's correct in them.
To break up the rest.
Yes. Oh, well, yes, yes. Well, first of all, okay, well, let's take it beat by beat. Let's take it beat by beat, okay? So the first 3/8 notes we want grouped together, right? Quarter note is 2/8 notes, right? So there's 1, 2. Here's the third, right? The way this is written implies that this 8th note belongs to this grouping, whereas this 8th note starts the next grouping of 3. So first, we split that, okay? There. So there's our first group of 3 here. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, right? So that's actually okay. And then this dotted quarter note is 3/8 notes, right? So 1, 2, 3. So now that reflects the 3 groups of triple. All right? Any questions? I know. This is one of those things that you have to kind of get in the mindset. And if you're confused, just break it down. Just tick out the 8th notes. You know, I mean, I went around last class, and you know, everyone who asked me a question, I kind of was drawing little 8th notes, you know, above your things, and that's how I think about it, and I think it helps. It's the difference between the pulse and the larger beat, right? So the time signature kind of gives us the larger beat. You know, 9/8, we want 3 big groups of 3. But each of those groups of 3 you can think of pulse-wise as 3, So you can think of it in terms of 9 beats as well, and I think that would help. So the second measure, right, let's think about that. This is how many 8th notes? 3. So standalone, so that's fine. That represents itself. This, however, is how many 8th notes? 4. So that does not accurately reflect what's going on there. So what can we do? What can we do to make that still be the same value but look as if it were grouped in 3s? What do you think, Chris Day? No, how could we rewrite this to reflect it as being divided in 3?
You could break it into a dotted quarter note and then an 8th note.
Right. Take a lesson. So this tied together is the same value as a half note, right? It's still 4/8 notes. But the way this is now written, you know, here's a group of 3, and then this 8th note and this quarter make the last group of 3. It looks kind of funny, but always what you want to do, I mean, you know, don't get flustered with these things. What you want to do is reflect the larger beat, okay? So just think, what is the larger beat? How many big beats are there? And, you know, what notes are, you know, is it 3/8 notes or 2/8 notes? And then go ahead and group things, okay? This one's a bit tricky, this next one, 2/2. So what is 2/2? It's not a time signature you'll see very often. How many beats?
2 half notes.
2, yeah, right, 2 beats, right? Remember 2 times half? So each measure will have 2 beats, but very long beats. So when we're doing this, you want to take all these and bar them together, tie them together so that they reflect 2 beats. Okay? So, why is that wrong? It's grouped into how many groups there in that first measure? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So, how many eighth notes are there in a whole? Or a half note?
4.
4, right? So we would take the first 4, and there's our 1 big beat, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, and we want to reflect that they are all together. So there we group them together. And then here, 2 is our second big beat, right? So we want to group all the rest of those together. So we bar them like this. All right? That makes sense? How's that look? How's that look, Chris? No, don't be, I'm not trying to.
Looks fantastic.
That's right. Darn tootin', this looks really good, really, really good. How about then the second measure? This is a bit tricky. This is, right? So we want to reflect the 2 big beats. Here's the first big beat. Where in the world is that second beat? Somewhere lost in
That
that
second grouping of
that
eighth
doubly
notes.
dotted. What's that?
That second grouping of eighth notes at the end.
Second grouping of eighth notes at the end. This one?
Yeah,
Yeah. What about it?
that would be your second beat.
That would be the second beat, but that's only a quarter note's worth of value there.
It's the,
We need a whole note, right? Because it's two half notes. So we want to reflect 2 groups of 4 eighth notes or 2 half notes values. Right. So, Donna, what did you say?
it's in with the dual dotted quarter note.
It's in the doubly dot. The doubly dot they call it, which sounds very silly or whatnot. So how many eighth notes are actually in that doubly dot? Right? You remember the dot adds half of the value back to it,
Yeah, so it's 3.
and then the second dot adds half of that half value. So, right. So we have a quarter note, 2 eighth notes. We add with the first dot half back to it, eighth note, and then half again back to it. So half of that half there would be a 16th note, right? So that makes that many. Okay, so how then could we rewrite that doubly dotted note to reflect that value? What do you think? All right, remember we want to make basically 2 groups of 4 eighth notes. So how many more do we need for the first group, right? We have 2, so we need.
So use the 2
2
eighth
more.
notes.
Right. So 2 eighth notes, or we could write that as a quarter note.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, so there's our first grouping. And now we need to account for that. Well, so how could we write a quarter note and an eighth note in one value? Or eighth note and a 16th note in one value?
And
Dotted
dotted-
16.
That dot is
Or
eighth.
dot and 8, sorry.
Right, so dotted
Yeah.
eighth note tied together there. And we have to group the last 4 together here. So, boom. Let me make that a bit cleaner so you can see. So, eighth note, right? 2 eighth notes. And then to reflect, this is a 16th note, you'd add kind of a little half flag there. Alright? So you see now that reflects 2 groupings of basically 4 eighth notes. I know, this is a little tricky. This is a little tricky. Just always think, how many big beats do I need? And then how many of what kind of note are within those big beats? And then try to count up, such as in 12/8 here. 12/8's more fun. Let's do the 12/8. 2/2 you'll never see. I mean, you see it in some Renaissance music when it's transcribed strangely. You see it in some band music, but really it's not, because it's a very slow kind of pace. So you won't really see it, encounter it very too much.